The air that morning was still, the kind of heavy silence that presses down on the world before something happens. The construction crew had been working the clearing for 3 days, widening an access road for a new housing development outside the sleepy town of Fairhaven. The land was thick with pine, their trunks leaning inward like sentinels, their roots tangled in the damp earth. Beneath them lay 40 years of secrets. The backhoe operator, a man named Eli Barrett, had just cut into a dense patch of soil when his bucket hit something solid with a hollow metallic groan. The sound didn't belong there. It wasn't the muffled thud of a rock or the splinter of a root. This was sharper, a cold vibration that rattled up the arm of the machine. The crew gathered, the sun hanging pale in the spring sky, as Eli brushed away the dirt with the bucket's edge. What emerged first was yellow paint, dulled to the color of old parchment, streaked with rust. Then came the curve of a roof, the faint outline of windows, each one opaque with mud and moss. They thought it might be an old camper, maybe an abandoned service vehicle. But then someone saw the stenciled black letters, half-faded but unmistakable. Fairhaven Elementary. The bus was wedged deep in the soil, angled slightly downward as though it had been swallowed whole by the earth. The rear emergency door faced them, its handle frozen in place under layers of corrosion. Eli cut the engine. The forest seemed to lean closer. Nobody spoke for a long moment. They all knew the story. Anyone who had lived in Fairhaven for more than a year did. The missing 15, the teacher, Miss Delaney, the vanished school trip of 1986. Most of them had grown up hearing it whispered at sleepovers or traded between teenagers around campfires. But seeing the bus here, real and rusting, stripped the legend of any safe distance. One of the younger workers muttered that they should call the sheriff. Another swore under his breath and stepped away, refusing to go near it. Eli climbed down from the cab, boots sinking into the loamy soil. The air smelled wrong now. Not like the sweet resin of pine, but something sour and damp, like wet cloth left too long in the dark. He reached out and laid his hand on the cold metal. It took hours for the sheriff's department to arrive, and by the time they did, word had spread. A crowd formed along the edge of the access road. Locals, reporters, the curious. The deputies roped off the site. Floodlights were hauled in as evening closed around the clearing, bathing the bus in a harsh white glare that made its windows gleam like blind eyes. Sheriff Marlowe, a man with silver hair and a voice that rarely rose above a drawl, ordered the emergency door cut open. Sparks showered onto the dirt as the metal screeched under the saw's blade. The moment the seal broke, a rush of air spilled out, heavy with an earthy, almost metallic tang. Inside, dust floated in lazy spirals. Mold feathered the edges of the seats. Some of the seatbelts were still fastened, their nylons stiff with age. A pink lunchbox lay on its side beneath the third row, its clasp rusted shut. On the back step rested a single child's shoe, green with moss, its laces knotted tight. But there were no bodies, no bones, no scraps of clothing beyond what had been abandoned. It was as if the 15 children and their teacher had simply stood up and walked away before the bus had been buried. Marlowe climbed the narrow aisle to the driver's seat. There, taped to the dashboard with yellowed strips of packing tape, was a single sheet of lined paper. The handwriting was looping, feminine, the kind you might see on a blackboard. Miss Delaney. 15 names were written in neat columns beside ages, 9, 10, 11. And beneath the last name, in thick red marker, someone had scrawled, "We never made it to Morning Lake." The disappearance had been the town's wound for almost 4 decades. In April of 1986, Miss Laura Delaney, a first-year homeroom teacher, had volunteered to chaperone a Springfield trip to Morning Lake Nature Preserve. 15 students boarded the bus that morning under a cloudless sky. Witnesses said they left the school parking lot around 8:15 a.m., heading north. They were seen once more at the edge of the old highway, the bus idling at a stop sign before making a left turn, not the right it should have taken. After that, nothing. The preserve was only 40 miles away, but the bus never arrived. Search parties combed the forests, divers swept the lake, helicopters scanned the highways for signs of an accident. Theories bloomed and withered. A mechanical failure leading them off the road into a ravine, a sinkhole swallowing them whole, a deliberate abduction. But there were no tire tracks, no debris, and no ransom note. Morning Lake became a name spoken softly, if at all. Some said it had always been cursed, that long before the town was built, the land had been the site of strange vanishings. Hunters who went missing for weeks only to reappear miles away with no memory. Canoeists who drifted out onto the water and were never seen again. At night, locals swore you could hear children's laughter echoing faintly from the trees, even in the dead of winter. The lake itself seemed normal in daylight, its surface smooth as glass, the surrounding pines dense and fragrant. But no one swam there anymore. Back in the present, forensics teams in white suits moved in and out of the bus, collecting samples. They found something odd in the dust layered over the floor. Soil with a mineral composition not found anywhere near Fairhaven. It was darker, almost black, with a faint briny odor. Some of it was caked around the bases of the seat bolts, as if it had seeped in from below. Sheriff Marlowe requested the state crime lab analyze it, but the preliminary word from a lab tech was that it more closely matched sediment from deep lake beds than from forest soil. A week after the bus was unearthed, I came to Fairhaven. I'd been covering cold cases for nearly a decade, but this one had a gravity to it I couldn't ignore. The locals were polite but guarded. This was their grief, their ghost story, and they didn't trust outsiders to tell it right. I spoke to an elderly man named Clayton Reeve, who had been a volunteer searcher back in '86. He remembered finding strange signs near the lake's western shore, narrow prints in the mud that looked like children's feet but were spaced too far apart, as if whatever left them had been taking enormous strides. He also remembered the fog that came in without warning, curling low over the water and blotting out the far bank. "That lake don't like to give back what it takes," he told me, eyes glistening under the brim of his cap. "Sometimes it waits." At night, alone in my motel room, I replayed my recordings. During the sheriff's press conference at the dig site, there had been a moment, barely audible under the murmur of voices, where a high, thin giggle slipped through. I hadn't noticed it while I was there. The sound seemed to come from close to the microphone, not from the crowd. I played it again and again until I could almost convince myself it was just interference. Almost. The following evening, I was granted permission to step inside the bus. The deputies had finished their work for the day, and a single floodlight lit the clearing. The interior was colder than the air outside, the smell of earth and mildew sharp in my nose. Dust coated everything, muting the once bright colors of the vinyl seats. As I walked down the aisle, my flashlight beam caught something on the wall near the driver's seat. A faint handprint, small enough to be a child's, pressed into the grime as if it had been made only yesterday. That night, it rained. I woke at 3 a.m. to a knock on my door. A deputy stood outside, pale and stiff, telling me I should come back to the site. We drove in silence through the wet forest. When we arrived, the floodlight was still burning, casting the bus in its cold glare. But now, on the fogged-over windows, shapes had appeared, smeared marks like tiny hands dragging downward. Inside, in the dust of the aisle, there were fresh footprints, small ones, bare. They led to the front of the bus and stopped at the driver's seat. The paper on the dashboard had changed. The red letters now read, "We're almost there." The message's new shape, "We're almost there," trembled under the flashlight's cone like a living thing. The deputy beside me crossed himself without seeming to notice he'd done it. Outside, rain stitched the clearing into a soft roar that made it hard to tell which sounds were real and which were memory. Sheriff Marlowe arrived 10 minutes later, jaw locked, eyes scanning every surface as if he could force the scene back to reason just by staring at it long enough. He muttered something about kids, about pranks and trespass, but his voice had no conviction. He ordered the site sealed for the night and turned to leave, pausing only when I asked if I could take a single photograph of the note. His gaze flicked to the paper, back to me. Then he nodded once. I raised my camera. The shutter clicked. It sounded too loud inside the quiet bus, like a door closing. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on the edge of the motel bed and listened to the rain. I opened my recorder and played back the press conference again, the static and murmurs and that small, bright giggle stitched between them like a stitch mislaid in a wound. At 4:21 a.m., the recorder picked up a sound I hadn't noticed before. A damp, low slosh, as if something heavy had moved through shallow water. It lasted 4 seconds, and then the tape hiss returned to its steady breath. I rewound and played it until the batteries died. The next day, the sky cracked into a brittle blue, washed clean by the night storm. The clearing looked different under the sun, less like a wound, more like a stage that had been swept and reset. The deputies were tired, their motions careful, ritualistic. Marlowe had set up a guard rotation. He told me, in his low, unwilling drawl, that none of his people had slept well. 3 of them reported the same dream. Sitting in a bus, fog pressed against the windows, Miss Delaney's voice trying to keep the children calm, and then the sensation of the bus sinking when the wheels were not moving at all. One deputy had woken standing up in his kitchen, hands on an imaginary steering wheel. Mid-morning, a state lab van arrived, a pair of geochemists stepping out with cases and clipboards. They took samples from under the seats, the floor seams, the wheel wells. In the early afternoon, one emerged, lifted her safety glasses, and told Marlowe that the fine silt caked beneath the driver's seat didn't match any known profiles from the county. It was closer to deep lake floor sediment, not from the shallow edges where cattails and lily pads live, but from the cold, still places where sunlight doesn't reach and bones take a long time to forget. If this thing was buried here since the 80s, she said, it wasn't alone. Something moved through it. Or it moved through something. She didn't like the sentence even as she said it. Science has a smell when it brushes up against a story it cannot wear. I spent the afternoon in town, talking to people who hadn't wanted to talk before there was a rusted bus bleeding through their soil. A retired mechanic remembered working on the school system's vehicles in 1986, and swore the bus in question had a sticky door that only opened if you jiggled the handle twice, fast, and then pushed your shoulder into it. You never forget the quirks, he told me, hands making useless motions as if a ghost of the handle lived in the air between us. That door never wanted to save nobody. A former dispatcher, now stooped and fierce, said that on the morning of the trip, a report came in from a woman driving behind the bus on County Road 9. The turn signal blinked right for the highway to Morning Lake, but the bus turned left toward the logging road. I thought she transposed it, the dispatcher said, eyes lost in the distance. But I typed it as she said it. Right blinker, left turn. She shook her head. Like a thing telling one truth and doing another. Late in the day, I drove to the lake. Morning Lake sits like a mirror fallen between the pines, wide enough to trick you into thinking it has horizons. Its water has a dark cast even at noon, the surface showing you sky while the body keeps its own counsel. The old nature preserve building still stands. A squat frame of weathered wood with a closed sign that's become part of the door by osmosis. I walked the soggy path to the western shore, where Clayton Reeve had said he'd seen the long-spaced child prints 40 years ago. Something in the air tightened the closer I came, as if the lake were holding its breath and waiting to see if I remembered the proper way to move through a place that does not welcome you. I stood on the bank and listened. You can tell yourself the lap and suck of water against roots is only physics. You can insist that the hush you feel entering your bones is nothing but the brain's superstition. But I've learned to attend to the quiet that presses when a story is about to tell itself through you. I took a recording. I spoke the names from Miss Delaney's list, one by one, saying them into the wind like they were coins I could offer to something I couldn't see. Between the 5th and the 6th name, The recorder caught the brief, tremulous whisper of a child answering from too far away. I didn't hear it then. I wouldn't hear it until later, when the distance between time and me had thinned enough to make the sound mean what it meant. In town that night, the tavern filled up the way it does when people need to be near the hum of their own kind. I sat at the bar and nursed one beer for 3 hours, watching a local news report loop the same footage of the bus under floodlights, the same tight shot of the pink lunchbox. The anchor's voice found a way to make new words feel like remembering something old. A woman slid onto the stool beside me, her face all angles you'd call handsome in a man and too much in a woman if you were cruel. She introduced herself as Luan. She'd been in 4th grade in 1986, not in Miss Delaney's class, but across the hall, where the smell of chalk and pencil shavings was the same and the way the air trembled with the leaving was shared. "It changed this town," she said, catching my eyes with an honesty that made me sit up a little straighter. It froze a part of us at the moment the bus blinked away. After that, we kept acting like we live in a regular place because you have to. But they say now and then, at the lake, or in the woods at the back of the cemetery, you can hear Miss Delaney reading a book in that voice of hers. Not the words, just the care. She looked at the TV, at the hollow frame of the bus like a rib cage. "If they didn't die, where did they go?" she asked me. "That's the wrong question around here," an older man cut in from his stool down the line. "You ask what got in." I could have left the story there and written something that moved like a careful hand over old pain, but the bus would not allow that. It kept drawing itself into my days, the way certain accidents stitch themselves across the inside of your eyes, so that when you blink, you don't see the dark, but the bright image of the thing burning on your lids. The guard shift at the site swapped every 4 hours. On the 3rd night after the footprints appeared, just after midnight, the deputy on watch called the station to say his radio was full of water. Not literally, no liquid inside the set, but everything he heard was the drowned, muffled muddle of voices submerged. He hit it with his palm, turned the knobs, got the same sound, murmurs and the push of water against shore. Then, a clear voice amid it, a woman in calm teacher cadence saying, "Eyes up front, please." And the radio went dead. I went back to the site in the morning. The air felt packed, like a suitcase closed by a knee. My camera was heavy in my hand. The bus had begun to smell like wet leaves left in a plastic bag. Marlowe let me stand at the door while the crime lab techs finished their pass. I watched a dusting brush make moons across a window. I watched a gloved hand cradle the pink lunchbox and set it carefully into a clear tub as if it were a fragile animal pretending to be asleep. When the techs were done, the sheriff gave me a look that had traveled a long way. "Do your walk," he said. "Not long." I went down the aisle slowly, as if each row of seats were a mouthful of things it might say if I moved too fast. At the 3rd row, where the lunchbox had lain, I knelt and snapped a few frames. It was worse to photograph the absence than the thing itself. Emptiness bears its own weight, if you insist on mapping it. At the front, I stood beside the driver's seat, looking down at the taped class list. The red message remained. "We're almost there." The handwriting was different now, though. I couldn't have told you how until I saw it. The line weights, the pressure of the pen at the turns, and recognized something that looked like a mimicry, as if a hand had practiced human insistence. I raised the camera again. The air pressed the skin along my forearms into goose flesh. I clicked the shutter. The paper rustled in a windless bus. That evening, I convinced Luann to take me to the house of someone the town had long since decided not to believe, but never managed to forget. His name was Gilbert Pike, and in 1986, he'd been the driver assigned to the morning lake trip until the regular driver, a man named Doyle, showed up late and took the wheel anyway. Gilbert had pounded the break room fridge with his fist, they said, and shouted that no one should take the kids that way, not until the fog on the North Road cleared, not until the sign was fixed. Which sign? No one remembered. or had chosen to remember. Gilbert had 2 DUIs in the early 90s, and then got sober, and then got quiet. In his small house now, the curtains were drawn. He wore a flannel shirt that had seen more seasons than it deserved. He squinted at us and tried to close the door, and then Luan said the name Miss Delaney in a voice that made him stop with his hand on the jamb. "She tried," he said, becoming a person who would talk before he could stop himself. "She did everything right once it started going wrong. You could see it. She got the kids to sing. She put herself between them and the windows when the dark got on the glass. That woman made a hallway out of herself and stood there." "How do you know?" I asked. "Because I dreamed it," he said. "Because I sat there in that sticky seat and the fog came up through the floor like breath from a buried mouth, and the bus didn't move but my stomach thought we were falling. I dreamed it that night, and the night after, and 3 times a week, for 10 years until I drank myself out of dreaming. And then I saw it again sober, and it was the same, always the same." She went forward to the driver and touched his sleeve. And he wasn't Doyle. It was Doyle's shape, and his jacket, and his wrists. But when he looked at her, he had no tired in his eyes like a man and no fear, just that open lake look. The kind where you can pour yourself in and never see a ripple. Gilbert's voice fell apart. "You think I want to say that?" he asked. "You think I want to know that's the thing I know?" He shut the door gently, which felt worse than a slam. I recorded until my recorder felt complicit. The hybrid nature of the story, the part that still wanted honest human hands to be at fault, kept tugging. I dug into Doyle's file. He died in 2009. A tree limb falling in a storm and breaking his neck as cleanly as a snapped pencil. The report said the limb must have been rotted from the inside. In 1986, he had 1 citation for rolling through a stop sign and a commendation for helping evacuate a bus during a minor engine fire. In his file, between the laminated training certificates and the grease-smudged evaluation forms, was a Polaroid of the class that had gone missing. 15 kids, eyes shining with the quietless brightness of 9 to 11-year-olds, and Miss Delaney, shoulders slightly forward, her smile the kind you give a camera when your mind is already elsewhere counting heads. Doyle wasn't in the photo. On the back, someone had written, "Morning Lake," with the exclamation point curling like a child's. The pen had pressed too hard. The words were nearly carved into the paper. The day after we spoke with Gilbert, the construction company pulled their equipment off the site. The developer issued a statement about sensitivity and respect. He'd resume work when the county said the ground could be touched again. That evening, a small vigil gathered at the edge of the clearing. Candles winked between the trees. One of the missing children's brothers, now a man with a back stooped by work I did not ask him to name, stood and spoke in a voice that scraped. "We made our peace with not knowing," he said. "We had to. But this is the not knowing come back dressed in a body. We have to look at it again." He let the match burn his finger before he let it go. I returned to the bus after the candles had burned down. I went alone, because part of me believed the bus wanted me alone, and because saying that sentence out loud would make me a different sort of person than the one who pays taxes and returns carts to the grocery corral. The night air was all needles and damp. The floodlight hummed. The bus glowed with the sick pallor of a thing lit from the outside when it ought to carry its own light. I stepped up into the aisle and paused. You know the peculiar hollow click your heart makes when something you expect to be still moves by a fraction? That was the sound I felt inside my bones when the seat cushions exhaled. I don't have a better word. They let something go. A memory of weight. I lifted my recorder. "This is me, inside the bus, alone," I said. And my voice sounded like a person pretending competence. "I'm going to the front.